Good evening, folks. Thank you for coming on, I'm not sure if I sort of say gloomy day, but just coming back from Tokyo, and it was pretty sunny every day, so this is a little bit gloomy, but hopefully the presentation and the keynote lecture we're going to give kind of brighten up some of that gloom over here. My name is Anantha Duraiappah, the Executive Director of the International Human Dimensions Program. And the way we're going to structure this day would be an introduction by Jakob Reiner, the Vice Rector of UNU, which hosts the International Human Dimensions Program here in Bonn, and followed by a keynote lecture by Partha Dasgupta, and then followed by a quick presentation of some of the preliminary results of the IWR 20. I shouldn't use the word preliminary. It's actually the results from the IWR 2012. And we'll have Q&A from the floor. I see a lot of students here, so I'm hoping that we'll have some really hard-pressing questions for Professor Dasgupta, keep him on his toes. And then we'll have a final wrap-up and some reflections from a very distinguished guest from our DG in Cologne, Gudrun Timm, who has come over here, and she's sitting right in front. Now, starting off, Jakob Reiner is unable to be here today, not because he wasn't interested in it. He's in bed sick. And I hope that he gets better very soon, but it must have been pretty serious for him not to come today because he was pretty excited. So a little bit of what I would think what he would say. I'm going to try to attempt to do that and basically sort of say a little bit about UNU and sort of say how IHDP sticks within UNU. The UNU, the United Nations University in Bonn, is what I think is the second largest outfit outside the headquarters up in Tokyo. That's where the headquarters of the United Nations University is. So it represents two key organizations. One is the Vice Rectorate for Europe, kind of oversees the UNU institutes in the European region. But he's also the director of the, there's a big institute called the Environment and Human Security Institute. And they host three, the Environment and Human Security, then the International Human Dimensions Program, and then the UN Water Program. So those are the three main programs that make up the UNU in Bonn. Now I'll talk a little bit about IHDP. So Jakob Reiner moves aside, and I'm going to talk a little bit about IHDP. The International Human Dimensions Program is one of the 4 global change programs which addresses issues on the global landscape. The other 3 are the International Geosphere-Biosphere Program that looks at all the natural sciences, primarily driven by the natural scientists. Diversitas, which looks at the biodiversity, but still pretty much driven by the natural sciences. And then we got the World Climate Research Program, which basically is on the natural sciences of climate change. And then IHDP is the 4th, which basically looks at the human dimensions and therefore the main conduit of bringing in the social sciences to address these problems at a global level. So basically global environmental change. IHDP has been hosted by UNU since 2007. And so that brings us 5 years, half a century. We should celebrate. We always find reasons to celebrate at the secretariat. So this is another one. It's a small secretariat, but I think it's a pretty dynamic and young, talented secretariat, which I took over about 2.5 years ago, and I'm very proud of them. And so that's basically the background on the International Human Dimensions Program. We're already running into time, so I'm going to introduce the first keynote lecture for today, Professor Dasgupta. I don't need to say much about him. I'm sure everybody has heard about him and his name, and we're very happy and honored to have him here. Professor Dasgupta took over the chair of the IHDP Science Committee in 2010 as I was coming in as the new executive director of IHDP. So we are very happy to get him to take on this role in spite of his very busy schedules. As many of you know, he is the Frank Ramsey Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Cambridge. I've got about 6 pages here of him, but I'm going to cut short to maybe 2. His CV goes on and on. But one of the things that I find special about Partha is that he's not an environmental economist. He's an economist, and he has published across the whole range of economic disciplines. And some of the ones have been on social capital, theory of games, economics of malnutrition, and I think the one that he's going to talk about today a little bit more is on health as well. So he's well published across a whole range of economic disciplines. He has been the president of the European Association of Environmental and Resource Economists, and that's just one of many. The one that I want to highlight is he's a fellow of the British Academy as well as the fellow of the Royal Society. I'm not sure if, Partha, if you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he's the first social scientist to be a fellow of the Royal Society, which has always been primarily for the natural sciences. He's also a fellow of the Third World Academy of Sciences, or I think it's been renamed as the World Academy of Sciences. He also carries the title Sir. He was knighted by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth in 2002 for his services to economics. And some of his best-known works as a PhD student, I'm not intending to make him feel old, but it's more that I took my PhD when I was relatively old, was his economic theory and exhaustible resources with Jeffrey Hill. And the one that I found extremely useful in a lot of my more recent work, and as well as in terms of the IWR, is the Human Well-Being and the Environment, a 2001 publication, which I found very illuminating and extremely useful for a lot of my work. A little bit, I met Professor Dasgupta first in 1986 when I was a grad student, just entered the University of Texas at Austin doing my PhD in economics. And he was visiting, and I took my first course in development economics from Partha. And that kind of really also inspired me to continue working on that field, as well as then making the bridge with environmental economics. And so he was kind of pretty instrumental in the early years of my work in economics. And then met him again in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2005, so quite a long in between. And he was basically an advisor with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and we basically oversaw the work on the human well-being section. And then at that time, I think we kind of cooked up this crazy idea of doing something called an IWR. And after about 6 years of a lot of efforts in fundraising and doing the usual stuff that you need to produce something like this, we produced it in 2012. So here we are, and without any much further ado, I want to welcome Professor Dasgupta to the podium, and we'll look forward to listening to what he has to say to us today.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. And I want to use this occasion to, not so much as a keynote lecture, that's too formal for the occasion. This should be a seminar. I want to run it with Pablo. But being much older than he, I'm going to take more time than he's allotted, all right? So that's the deal. But we should see this as two parallel lectures addressing a question of the most profound importance, and we're trying to make some sense of the question by providing some tentative answers. I'm working backwards now. The results that I'll be reporting here will complement Pablo's. About the same time as the Inclusive Wealth Report 2012, which Anantha was speaking, was published, I think the same month, a paper was published by 5 of us, Kenneth Arrow, myself, Larry Goulder, Kirsten Olsen, and Kevin Mumford in the journal Environment and Development Economics. They were addressing the very same question with different databases, and we got very similar answers. So I'll be giving some highlights of the results in that paper. Pablo will be speaking about IWR 2012. And let me just say that bad news is that's all there is in the literature so far. and this is 2012. So we ought to be collectively ashamed of ourselves as citizens of the world. And I'll have something to say about that, perhaps at question time, as to how sluggish academia can be. So these publications are really about economic evaluation. And there are essentially 5 reasons, 5 types of questions we ask when we evaluate economies. Question 1, how has our economy been doing? Another question is, how are we doing now? Another question is, how is the economy likely to behave under business as usual? A 4th question we ask is, how good is this particular policy that we are considering in terms of its effect on the economy? And the 5th question that we ask, when I say we, I mean economists ask, what's the best policy? That's rarely answerable, but certainly the 4th one is very common. 4th one is asked when, for example, an investment project rears its head and the government wants to know whether it should pass that project or reject it. In third world countries, it's very commonly practiced. Now, if you read newspapers, it's the first 2 questions, or put it, perhaps including the 3rd question, that are most common. UN agencies are also are much concerned about asking how things have been happening, how things have gone. They do cross-country comparisons of how things have gone. They do cross-country comparisons of how things are, and so forth. How have we been doing is a kind of question that's asked in sustainability analysis. It studies an economy as it moves through time and asks if, at a subsequent time, the economy is, in some sense, better off than it was previously. If it was, you say, gosh, we have progressed. If it isn't, then you say, gosh, something is wrong, we have regressed. So you're comparing an economy, a given economy, as it moves through time. The notion of sustainability is really concerned with that class of questions because it's asking whether the development that you're enjoying and you think is a good thing is sustainable. And sustainability, by the Oxford Dictionary, means the non-deterioration of whatever that object is which you want to see sustained. Okay? That is preserved in some sense, that index, that object, the thing that you care about. Whereas the 4th and 5th questions that I've just now mentioned are concerned with policy analysis. In policy analysis, the perturbation, the change that you're trying to study and evaluate is a change that is taking place now by choice of policy. If you accept a project, the economy veers in one way, in one direction. If you reject the project, then the economy will be pursuing a slightly different, possibly slightly different trajectory. And you want to compare those 2 trajectories. And social cost-benefit analysis is, of course, the standard route to doing that kind of an exercise. Sustainability analysis, in some sense, is newer than policy analysis. In economics, social cost-benefit analysis is at least now 50 years old. But sustainability analysis, certainly the expression, is only 2-3 decades old, and we've tried to make sense of it. The key question, of course, is whether you're doing sustainability analysis or policy analysis, what is the object that you're trying to judge the performance of the economy by? I should say also that when I'm using the term economy, I don't necessarily mean a nation. The analysis that I'll be giving you, the conceptual background that I'll be elaborating in the next half an hour, is applicable to any conception of an economy. The economy could be an individual, it could be a household. We very often ask, how are we doing in our household? Are we better off this year than we were 10 years ago? It could be a village, it could be a city, it could be a state, it could be a nation, and sometimes, of course, when we think of global climate change, we even think about the world as a whole, and think of the world economies, in some sense, progressing or regressing. So nothing I say is really conditioned on the dimensions of the economy that we are studying, except that the numbers I'll be giving you will be based on national statistics, but that's only because national statistics are the ones which are mostly on offer. Okay? Now, the way I have posed these two distinct types of analysis, sustainability analysis and policy analysis, might suggest that there are two different sets of exercises. And certainly until about 10 years ago, I hadn't realized that they were not different. Now, it's one of the virtues of doing economic theory or any kind of science is to try and unify things which look very different. And indeed, it is the case that these two exercises are essentially the same. But there is a difference. In sustainability analysis, you're comparing an economy as it moves through time. And therefore, the change, and I'll use the word perturbation for the word change. I'll use it instead of change because perturbation is slightly more technical, and it's probably more familiar to you than, say, change. The perturbation to an economy in sustainability analysis is the passage of time. Today versus yesterday. Tomorrow versus today. Next year versus this year. Decade hence against 9 years hence, and so forth. All right? As an economy moves through time, you're comparing it across two dates. All right? So the change that you observe is the one which is occasioned by the passage of time, under, of course, existing policies or changes in policy for that matter. Whereas in policy analysis, let's say project analysis, the decision maker is saying, yes, I'll accept the project, which means the change is now enacted from the moment the investment is undertaken. So the comparison that you are making is at the time the decision is made between one possible trajectory versus another possible trajectory. So the perturbation that a project introduces into an economy is a change in the way the economy is going to be run. The project will take away resources from elsewhere to it and will provide additional resources injected into the economy from the ones that were planned if the project were rejected. Okay? But it's still comparison. It turns out that the two questions are the same, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Because, of course, the issue is, what is it that we care about when we talk about assessing the performance of an economy? In what follows, I'll be thinking, obviously, over the long run. If we are interested in sustainability analysis, we are thinking in terms of moving through time. So we do want to introduce not only the well-being of those who are alive, but also those who will come under the forecasts, people in the future. Otherwise, the whole exercise would be shorn of its urgency or the motivations that lead us to ask the questions about sustainability analysis, because we care about our children, grandchildren, and future generations. It is quite interesting to somebody who has practiced economics for 40 years that now, for the first time in applied economics, you're allowed to think about a time horizon of 100 years, 200 years, and so forth. Of course, the future becomes more and more hazy as you peer into the distant future, but haziness is not an argument for not thinking. You build uncertainty into your thing, and you recognize that it's hazy, but you can still debate with yourself and amongst people as to whether one scenario is more plausible than another, and still think in terms of making decisions. So we are thinking about the well-being of not only today, but also of people tomorrow, day after, and so forth. And the key question then arises as to what well-being means. And of course, I'm not in a position by any stretch of imagination to give you an answer, but here's what I will be doing. There's a huge literature today discussing notion of human well-being. Before coming here, we were at coffee, a group of us were sitting and exchanging information about the fact that, expressing our curiosity over the fact that in the last 5-10 years, happiness has re-entered the vocabulary of economic dialogue. It was certainly the vocabulary of economic dialogue 50 years ago, certainly during the Elizabethan period, in Edwardian period, because at that time, utilitarianism, at least in England and in the United States, held sway. And of course, utility was one interpretation of utility, certainly in the form that Sidgwick gave it, was pleasure, happiness. So we seem to have returned to it in some way or the other. Utilitarianism went through a bad patch for a long while, rather unfavorable patch for a long while, because very often Democrats rightly said that, look, it's not the business of governments to make people happy. The business of government is to make it possible for people to lead their lives in the way they best feel without hurting other people. It's the standard. The rich liberal tradition is of that kind. So it's not measuring it in terms of happiness, but it's measuring in terms of the ability of governments to keep order and allow people to get on with their lives and make mistakes if that's what they want to do, or make mistakes despite their best intentions. So you have alternative views, goes without saying, of how to judge projects or how to conduct sustainability analysis. I will have nothing to say about what is the right way of viewing well-being, because I have nothing to say. I have views, but that's not, as a lecture, you don't, I mean, it's my view versus yours. That's not very interesting. What would be interesting is the following. Suppose it's very difficult to, even if you're a utilitarian, it's damn difficult to measure utility. Usually these are nonlinear functions of goods and services, and nonlinear functions are very difficult to estimate, extremely difficult, and sometimes impossible. Believe me, we economists know about that, because one of the things we economists back in the 19th century, Dupuy and others tried to do in cost-benefit analysis was to recognize, I mean, they recognized that you needed, if the project was significantly large, you needed to measure consumer surplus. And that's a nonlinear function. And that's a real mess. There's a literature out there also. Okay, so it's very difficult to measure. But we know one thing. No matter what conception of well-being you adopt, goods and services are involved. Extreme cases would be a pure hedonist who says his or her pleasure or state of mind depends on the consumption of goods and services. That's, of course, one extreme case, and the case that probably is at the back of the mind of the hardcore economist, or put it this way, hardcore economics text. Utility depends on consumption of goods and services. Another extreme, when I say extreme, I don't mean unidimensional extreme. It could be somewhere on a multidimensional space, but that is nevertheless an extreme, would be one where it could be very Brahmanic. Aristotle being, as you well know, a major Brahmin, in the sense of thinking of the ultimate aims of life, of a good life, of one of friendship, where friendship is developed. People have the kinds of activities, the higher activities, which make for a rich life. But even there, even if it's associations or capabilities, and the modern lingo, require for their development goods and services. So in a reduced form, no matter what your philosophical position is regarding what constitutes a good life, in a reduced form, well-being will depend on the flow of goods and services. In a reduced form, I say, because the ultimate object is not the goods and services, certainly not in the Aristotelian sense. But if you want to lead an Aristotelian life, you need food, you need nourishment, you need the transportation possibilities to meet your friends, if nothing else, and maybe have tea, if that helps for conversation and so forth. So there's no escaping economists. We are here for securely fastened to the safety belt because we have to produce a workable world in which goods and services are exchanged. Okay? So from now on, when I talk about goods and services, I don't necessarily mean when you're a hedonist economist. Your view could be much more ethereal than that. Okay. Here's the theorem. Goods and services, of course, are produced with assets. All right? Capital assets. What is a capital asset? Typically, we are thinking of durable goods. If a complete non-durable good is hardly an asset, you typically call it a service or something. So I'm thinking of, loosely speaking, I'm talking about durable goods as assets. One way of thinking of assets is to think about the productive base of an economy. And I'm going to be discussing that at some length in the next 5-10 minutes. But here's the theorem. The theorem says that no matter what your conception of intergenerational well-being, you name it, then corresponding to that notion is a set of notional prices of assets. And I'll come back to what I mean by assets in a minute, but for the moment, just take it loosely. Such that if you value the assets in terms of those notional prices and call that aggregate value wealth, IHDP calls it inclusive wealth, but I'll come to that in a minute, wealth, let's call it just wealth, then here is a property. Human well-being increases if and only if wealth increases. That's the theorem. That's the proposition. The link between assets and human well-being are, of course, the mediating thing, that set of objects which relate human well-being to the assets, the productive base, if you like. Or, no, the assets, I'll stick to that. Assets are the notional prices. Okay? So let me repeat. The theorem says the following. You give me a conception of intergenerational well-being, say utilitarian or Aristotelian, doesn't matter, then corresponding to that conception is a set of notional prices. We economists call them shadow prices. They're not to be confused with market prices. Even somebody as hostile to market prices as Sandel at Harvard would accept notional prices. These are just accounting measures. It's not prices in the sense of buying and selling. Such that if you value your assets in terms of those prices and call that aggregate value wealth, the wealth of the economy, then the wealth has the following property. Wealth increases if and only if human well-being increases. In this case, in the sustainability case, it means, of course, movement through time. If today's wealth is higher than yesterday's wealth, then we could say that society, including the future that remains, is better off than it was the previous period. And in the case of policy analysis, and just a 1-minute deflection from sustainability analysis, in policy analysis, I suggested that the two are the same, policy analysis and sustainability analysis. Policy analysis would say that wealth will increase if you accept this. If the project increases wealth, then the project is good in the sense of contributing to intergenerational well-being. It'll be positive contribution. You might say, that seems new. We've done our cost-benefit analysis, and we never heard of the expression wealth there. Now, I'd like to think that I'm going to surprise you, because what you are familiar with is the present discounted value of social profits of projects. You say, accept the project with the present discounted value of social profits is positive. That's another way of saying the social rate of return exceeds the social rate of discount. Well, that's a well-known criterion. It's been practiced in Germany for 50 years, probably, and the federal government probably has some approximations to that. Well, it's very easy to show that the present discounted value of the flow of social profits of a project is the increase in wealth that the project brings about to the economy. And I promised you that there was an equivalence between sustainability analysis and project analysis or policy analysis, and that's where it is. Okay, so that's the setup, that's the statement. Now the question is, how do you measure these notional prices? Of course, that's where you have to stop being a Brahmin and become unclean. You have to do all sorts of dishonest things, approximations, things that you don't care about. You would hate to tell your grandmother that you've been doing. So when I give you the numbers, you must take them with that kind of, not skepticism. Skepticism is not the issue. We all know they're wrong, but they're wrong in the right way. Everything we do is wrong, but this one is at least honest in recognizing where the errors come. And that's, of course, the real advantage, the real benefit of doing serious social science. You know you're wrong, but you know why you're wrong, where you're wrong. And if you don't do the social science well, you're wrong, but you haven't the faintest idea that you are, or you can't even have a discussion of where your errors are, so you won't know which direction to move to improve things. Now, prices, I'm not going to not keep on using the adjective notional or shadow. Prices, for my case, will be all, unless if I use it, it'll be when I use the word market. For many commodities, you might think markets may be a first approximation to these notional prices. Why? Well, one reason is if you're a Democrat, you say, well, after people are actually trading in those prices. So that must reflect something about their values regarding the substitutability of goods and services in their own reckoning, in their own notion of. And we economists these days, certainly educated people, are overly skeptical of this line of argument. You can't be, I mean, we were commenting on the fact that it's very hard being a Democrat because you have to buy many things which you may not care about in being a Democrat. But if you're a Democrat, you can't dismiss people's preferences and saying that that's irrelevant. That's an elitist viewpoint. So as a first approximation, you might say market prices. But of course, the whole point about environmental goods, environment, is that many prices are so wrong as not to be even a starter, okay? So we'll accept that. Now, prices suggest substitutability, and I want to talk very briefly about 4 types of substitutability, just as an opener to the empirical work, and I'll do in the next 10 minutes. One is substitutability among the values we hold. We all hold multiple values. We're pluralists. We believe in human rights. We believe in in enough food for people, and the two may clash. Preserving human rights up to the ultimate end might mean taking money away from other things that we care about. So obviously we do. Nobody has one value. We have many, and we do some trade-offs. Now you might say, well, that's not quite true. The language of rights goes against trade-offs. It says, no, there's a barrier. You cannot violate it. But even if the mathematics of maximization under constraints shows that even if you have a constraint, there is a notional price that you can put to that constraint, because you can ask, how much are you losing elsewhere or gaining elsewhere if you relax the constraint a little bit? So notional prices can be used even for human rights, in the sense that you can ask, what's the cost in terms of other things we value, say hospital beds and so forth, which we could have funded if we turned the other eye to some rights protection, okay? So there are substitutability among the values we hold, and a person holds. 2, there's substitutability among the well-beings of people, which is, of course, I hardly need to elaborate on that. We're doing that all the time, one person's well-being versus another. When we discuss progressive income tax, we are doing exactly that. Substitutability among direct factors determining a person's well-being. Shoes versus clothing, food versus schooling, and so forth. Those are standard things. And substitutability among the factors of production of goods and services. That's standard issues that we discuss in economics and in the world. We ask, how much can we substitute away from coal by having double glazing, and so forth, okay? All right, so that's going to be the backdrop on the basis of which we are going to talk about some prices. I talked about the productive base, and I suggested that in economies, capital assets are different from its productive base, and here is why. I'm going to be very quick with these because time will be, don't want to eat up into Pablo's time too much. So I'm going to make some ex cathedra statements now without much explanation, and in question and answer we can have a discussion over there. By capital assets, I will mean 3 types of assets. Produced capital, roads, buildings, machinery, and equipment, the usual category of assets that people think about. I'll think about human capital as a second, population size and composition, knowledge and skills, education, health, and enhancing the quality of life and extending life. And of course, you will find that 2, 3, that is health, is going to play a very dominant role here. And of course, natural capital, ecosystem, subsoil resources, and so forth. So these are the capital assets that an economy has. And you might say that doesn't ring true because we think about institutional capital, knowledge capital, social capital, and so forth. What about them? Well, it turns out the way I've classified it, these are enabling assets, certainly, and are part of the productive base. We very often say this society has a rich productive base because, gosh, they have a huge amount of culture, 2,000 years of culture, and that enables them to do many things otherwise they couldn't do. And that's absolutely true. It's part of the productive base, but they're not assets in my sense of defining wealth. So then where do these enabling assets make their presence felt? Notional prices. That's where they make their presence felt. Here's one simple example, and it'll make it clear. Consider two economies, absolutely identical islands, A and B. So they're literally identical. Each household here has a corresponding household, mirror image household there, and vice versa. Okay? So an anthropologist cannot tell them apart. However, in one island, let's call it island A, people trust one another. Literally trust. Don't ask why. They may have institutions and costless institutions here. They trust one another. They say, we'll do this, they'll do it, and so forth. And the other, they're completely distrustful. Okay? Now, in the former, you will say the institutions are good, social capital, trust, and so forth, all the things we care about and we feel are part of the productive base. But of course, in terms of produced capital, human capital, and natural capital at 2012, they're identical, remember, by definition. Okay, so where's the difference? The difference is that in the first island will thrive, the latter one won't. And the first one, they will be trading and doing things that will improve their lot. In the second one, they're all into autarkic households. And in 2 years' time, you'll see a huge difference between the two. What's the difference? Well, in the first island, wealth will be higher because the goods, the capital assets they have are more valuable. They're doing more things for them because they can trade it, they can produce things, sell it, and so forth and so on. So that tells you that, I mean, that's of course not a proof, but it's a pretty near proof to what I have in mind, which is that enabling assets influence the shadow prices of the goods and services. In a lousy economy, a building is pretty worthless. Nobody will come to it, because if you think you're going to get shot arriving at the building, you won't show up, the building will be unused. In a well-functioning economy, the building will be used and will have value. So there you are. So you mustn't think of social capital, knowledge, institutions as assets in the same way as the structures we see. Okay? All right, now I'm going to do some numbers with you. The paper I have in mind, I'll be very brief on this. We looked at produced capital. There we used market prices, okay, because the data are there for roads, buildings, machinery, equipment. National accounts give you data on the wealth, on these goods. Before I come to that, sorry, I missed mentioning one thing. So in sustainability analysis, remember the theorem that I mentioned was that wealth, if it increases relative to the past, then things are better. So we are looking at change in wealth. But now change in wealth is the same as the net investment that the economy has made. That's by definition. Investment is the change in the structure of capital assets in the economy. So the way you measure change in wealth is to look at the net investment. Now, net investment in what? Of course, the capital assets here is not just produced goods, but human capital and natural capital. Conventional accounting will not include 2 and 3. That's why investment statistics are very misleading. Investment statistics in national accounts are misleading because they miss out on human and natural capital. And of course, that's what inclusive wealth report tries to do, including human and natural capital, and what our paper tried to do. I'll be doing that. Now, under human capital, there's population, that's size and composition. And that causes real difficulties. So here is a simplifying theorem that I managed to prove some years ago, which we've used, both these publications have used, which is, instead of thinking of wealth, you think of per capita wealth. And of course, you're interested also in the distribution of wealth, but here I'm not going to be discussing distribution for time and data limitations. So the theorem is human well-being increases over time if and only if per capita wealth increases over that same period of time. Another way of saying is investment per capita is positive over that period of time. Okay? So what we've been trying to do is to estimate net investment, recognizing that net investment is the value of the net change, aggregate net change in these three categories of assets: produced capital, human capital, and natural capital. Okay? In our paper, natural capital, we could not do ecosystem services, and Pablo will also report that he couldn't do it. What we had in our paper was land, forest, but only as a source of timber, because ecosystem services are unavailable. The data are unavailable. Subsoil resources and carbon in the atmosphere. Those were the only four. For carbon, we used the conventional prices that are now used, about $50 per ton. However, I should say much of our paper is concerned with doing sensitivity analysis. Because we don't know what the right shadow prices are, you take ranges of them and see how the results depend on the value that you adopt. So we went up from 50 to 500 just to check how the wealth calculations depend on it. Right, so let me give you the next thing, which is human capital. Knowledge and skills are issues which have been much discussed in the economics literature under the term human capital, and there are standard techniques of trying to estimate the increase in education in a population and build that into the wealth index. It's health which is novel in our paper, in the sense that we had no idea of how the results are going to turn out when you include health. What we did for health was to look at only one aspect of health, which is life expectancy. And we, in all the countries in our sample, we had 5 countries in our sample. I'll give you only one country, namely India, because that's where I come from and it's interesting anyway. We looked at each of these countries' life expectancy over a period of time that we studied. Our period, by the way, was 1995-2000, that period, that 5-year period. There was increase in life expectancy everywhere, certainly in India. And so I'm looking at the Indian case now. And how do you measure its value? We used the value of a statistical life as a way of estimating the increase in human capital as a result of the fact that people were living longer over this 2-year period. And then you work backwards, estimate wealth, and then the change in wealth. Okay? We'll come back to under discussion later as to whether it was a reasonable move to use the value of a statistical life. But for the moment, I'm going to use that as, okay. Turns out, by the way, I should say before I come to the one thing that was really knocked me out, I didn't know much about the health economics, but we proved a few theorems to be able to use it in the way appropriate for sustainability analysis. We found that people everywhere want to live longer. Now, you might say, boy, is that a big insight? Who would have doubted it? What I didn't know was how much they value it. In India, the value of a statistical life, would you believe it, is $1.3 million. In the United States, it's about 6.3. Now, you mustn't from that conclude that the value of an Indian is lower than the value of an American. That's not the point. Poor people can't afford a higher value. They have to take risks, which rich people don't have to. So these differences in values just reflect that. Okay, so we're not talking about a fascist interpretation. We're talking about this is how life is. The poor are always getting screwed. Okay, we use the 1.3 million, but that's a hell of a lot of money, and that is shown in the composition of wealth per capita in India in 1995. Look at the order of difference. I mean, this is really staggering result. Produced capital per capita is $1.5 thousand, right? I'll ignore natural capital, I'll ignore education because they're the same order of magnitude. Human capital is $1.3 million. which means, of course, that, so the final column is giving you the total wealth per capita in India, given all the limitations. I've come clean about that. But what's really surprising was, to me, was that 98% of the wealth per capita is attributable to human health. Now, obviously, the first reaction is, it can't be right. And that was my first reaction. On the other hand, certainly, Kenneth Arrow called me and said, Partha, are we to believe this? So I said, you need some benchmark before you can disbelieve something. And since we have never done it, nobody has done this kind of exercise, how the hell do we know what is a reasonable number? We don't. So the real question is going to be to start criticizing the methods. And we can discuss that as we, change. But remember, sustainability analysis is about change in the, or the perturbation, the change in wealth per capita over this period. And here you have it. You have total change. I won't go through the numbers, but you can see health is higher, but 9 times higher, let's say, than the change in education, because people lived longer at the end of 2000 as compared to 95. And when you translate that increase through the value of a statistical life, it gives you a big number. And the percentage rate is, of course, very small in the case of health because the original base is so large. That's why. I noticed in natural capital there was a deterioration, which is, of course, how we start the analysis. We know that we are making mistakes relying on investment statistics because it doesn't take into account depreciation. And depreciation of capital, natural capital, is what concerns all of us who care about nature, because we are eating into capital. So there is a decline there, but the net change, and carbon, of course, is minus. It's minus value because minus $90, because there's been an increase in carbon content. But nevertheless, the total is a change is a plus 10,000, and as a percentage rate is 0.9%, and it's very small because of the large base that's given by health capital. Okay. So it's all very easy to explain once you have the original numbers. The question really is about whether you're to believe the original numbers and what we can do to improve it. I'm going to stop there. When we started this work, we were really concerned to bring in natural capital into wealth estimates. That was the name of the game. And we did that. The trouble was that in natural capital, most interesting and important natural capital in our judgment is missing because we haven't got the data on that. And that's ecosystem services. The oceans are going to rots. The wetlands in India are going to rots. That's shown, but I haven't been able to, we haven't got that in this natural capital column here because we don't have the shadow prices, okay? We don't even have good statistics on the quantitative and qualitative properties of ecosystems because governments don't measure them. What they do, because you have satellite imagery, you can get data on forest cover. That you do, but that's about it. What goes on inside the forest is known only by people who live in the forest and who are usually ignored because they're poor, marginal people, or they're known by forestry experts. I mean, not forestry experts, sorry, not forest, because they like cutting down trees. I mean ecologists who study the dynamics of the ecosystems underlying wetlands. That's how we started. But it turned out we wanted to do the whole complete job, at least as a first cut in empirical work on sustainability analysis. We wanted to take wealth seriously. And so we decided to introduce health. And when we did that, the whole calculation, estimation became skewed. And you can see it totally dominates the discussion. But we felt that good science means that you ought to be honest. If that's how it is, the numbers play out, publish it, and then 20 years' time, things will be different. I'll end with a conjecture. The conjecture is this, that no matter how refined you may make the analysis, subsequent analysis, health will be a very, very important part of the wealth of nations. And it should not surprise us, and it should make us pleased, because intuitively, that's what we care about. We want people to be healthy. All right. But my guess is, the conjecture is that in 20 years' time, the two sets of capital assets which will dominate, there'll be two sets of capital assets will dominate wealth. One is already dominating, which is health. The other will be natural capital. It doesn't dominate here now, and that's because we don't know very much about natural capital. And that is an embarrassment to humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Partha, for the illuminating presentation. I'm going to go straight on and invite Pablo Munoz. He's from the IHDP secretariat. And Pablo was basically the chap, if you come into IHDP at about 10, 12 o'clock in the night, sitting in his room, calculating all these numbers that Partha was sort of saying that it's a non-trivial task. So he's the architect for the IWR database that we have, and he's going to make some presentations. A couple of things that were challenged. One is we wanted to expand the number of countries. A lot of this work is drawn from the Arrow Dasgupta et al. Paper, the methodology. We kind of I wouldn't use the word fudge, we kind of cut corners. We manipulated some of that data for the IWR, but surprisingly, much of that results are very close to, for the countries that were covered by Arrow et al., they kind of came very close together. We made two attempts. One is to address water as an ecosystem service. We struggled, and it seems to be a lot of work that needs to be done on evaluating water regulating services, and especially to get those social values, not the market prices, but the social values. And the other one that we try to do is fisheries, which is a major problem in terms of it's a global public good. And we managed to get some databases, and we had it for 4 countries, very small. But as Partha was saying, it's a start, and we've put it into the database, and now what we're suddenly realizing once we release this report is that many people who have these databases are coming forward and saying, hey, we have actually databases on stocks of these types of species of fish across different parts of the world. So we're getting that particular database for the next 20 IWR, and then the real challenge is to then get the social values, which are those prizes that elude us. But without further ado, I want to ask Pablo to come and maybe make a presentation on some of those results for IWR 2012.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to follow up Professor Dasgupta's presentation by giving you a brief overview about the Inclusive Wealth Report. In the previous presentation, Professor Dasgupta was mentioning the importance of measuring the productive base of a country. In this case, we want to measure not only manufacturer capital, but also human capital, natural capital, and ideally social capital. The relevance, as it was mentioned, it's the capital base that provide multiple flows to not to the economy, but also in direct way when we look at the blue arrows. Yeah. So the purpose now is to basically to give you a brief overview about the results, but before doing so, I want to show you briefly which items, which assets we are specifically measuring. Yeah, if we start for natural capital, we will see that we are measuring fossil fuels, minerals, forests, and agricultural land. We can even break down these different categories, and for example, we will see that in the case of fossil fuels, we are measuring gas, oil, coal. In the case of minerals, we took about 10 different kind of minerals. Of course, some countries have better data than others, but in general, we were measuring these main 10 minerals. In the case of forest, we were measuring about the case of timber, but also we were measuring non-timber forest, some of non-timber forest benefits. If we go to human capital, we were measuring education, and we were also measuring health. In the case of manufactured capital, we were measuring, as Professor Dasgupta mentioned, equipment, machineries, roads, and buildings. This is mainly from the system of national accounts. Now, let me give you an overview of where we were measuring this. We chose 20 countries from all continents. As you can see, these countries represent about 72% of the world GDP and 56% of the population. There are the giant countries like United States and China, but we also chose small countries like Chile, for example, with a large reserve of minerals to see how the changes has been going on there. We chose in Africa and Nigeria because of the large oil reserves, and so on with different countries. Regarding the time span of analysis, we basically measure 19 years from 1990 to 2008, and on the annual basis. Now, let me just start presenting some figures and numbers. I'm going to start with the case of India. We have seen that India has been growing tremendously in the last 2 decades, with GDP growth rates about 6 to 8%. And what we see, if we compare the 2008 with regard to 1990, we will see that the change is for about 120% of GDP. So it was more than doubled. Now, if we look at now to the productive base of these countries, we see that the gray line will show you that produced capital was certainly increasing. Of course, produced capital is a component of GDP, so was also growing and even faster. However, we can also see on the other hand that other assets were depreciating. So when we look at the economy as an inclusive investment, some of the assets are certainly growing, as in the case of manufactured capital. And this is very much measured within the system of national accounts. But when we have a more holistic view of the system, we see that other items are declining, as it is the case of natural capital. Also, this is the orange line to give you the trend on human capital. When we compute the 3 types of capital, we'll give you the black line, which is inclusive wealth, the inclusive wealth index at a per capita level. Yeah. So the positive sign is that beside that there were very large GDP growth, still the inclusive wealth index was positive, which is it's an important sign in terms of future well-being. Now, I will plot a slightly different the same rates, the same figures for India, but just the black line still is, the black bar is still inclusive wealth, and then we see the decline in natural capital, positive manufactured capital, and human capital. Now, let me give you an overview of all the countries. The picture here at the first glance is that the green bars basically tell us that it is natural capital that has been decreasing in almost all of the countries. The only exception that we have is Japan, actually, which was slightly increasing. Regarding produced capital, also has been increasing in most of the countries. Some exceptions are Russia and Venezuela. And human capital has been increasing for all the nations. Now, here the matter is if inclusive wealth, that is the productive base evaluated at its price, has been declining or increasing. What we see basically that that 6 countries, there has been actually, the productive base has been declining. Let me give you, let me pick up one country of this one, just to give you an overview of what's going on there. So if we look at Venezuela, and we break down again, similar as we did in the case of India, what we see is that here 2 main capital categories has been declining, which is the case of manufactured capital and natural capital. We can even try to further understand, for example, why produced capital was declining. Here we see that investment is one of the main drivers, that investment in manufactured capital is one of the main inputs which feeds the produced capital account. But we see that it has been very stable basically over the 90s, even slightly declining, maybe due to when President Chavez came into power, maybe some arrangement there, new institution, whatever is the case. But it seems also that beside this, whether it was influencing or not, seems to be one more variable explaining a lot how investments move in the case of Venezuela. Now I'm plotting on the secondary vertical axis is the price of oil. In the case of Venezuela, this is very important. It's a very resource-based economy. So it's very much these 2 variables seems to be moving together quite a lot. But here the good point is that we are not, from an inclusive wealth perspective, oil could be very important, but if we don't record the decline in natural capital, we somewhat are, and just look at the investment, we are kind of missing some items that are depreciated, as it's the case of natural capital in this case. I would like to try to move away now a bit from produced capital and try to connect the idea also of Venezuela and Japan, 2 different, very different countries, certainly. And here we are measuring we were talking about basically inclusive wealth as a per capita level. Now, if we try to break down between inclusive wealth, just the formation of the different capital types and the population, what we see basically is that actually Venezuela, without counting population, was doing even better. We see this is the blue bar, was doing even better. However, it has a very huge population growth, about 2%. So this brings the idea about the speed at which resources growth and which population growth. This is certainly not a new issue. Probably it has already centuries, the idea that population grows faster than the resources. But it's still there. It still is happening that population, certainly in some countries, grow faster than the resources. In this case, the productive base. Now, let me give you an overview of the 20 countries that we were analyzing. On the top, you see the inclusive wealth index, and on the top, and the map on the top. But at the bottom, you will see at per capita level. You see basically how green means positive growth, red means negative growth, and orange means still positive, but very, 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 very small rates. So Venezuela turned from green to red, as I mentioned, but it's not the only country. There are other countries, especially low and middle-income economies, which still turn from green to red. This is the case of not only Venezuela, but Colombia, South America, Nigeria, South Africa, and Saudi Arabia. So before we were talking a little bit about potential policies in terms of investment. Here we move the idea of also approach this in an integrated way, population Now, I want to move about education, just to give a brief overview on educations. As in the accounting framework that we use for human capital, the key inputs, one of the key inputs is the average year of total schooling of the population. Now, however, in this graph, what I'm plotting is the expenditure in education and the human capital in the vertical axis. Here, basically, we see that, of course, we will see that the more the expenditure in education seems to be the higher the human capital, as we see in the top corner. All high-income economies like USA, Japan, UK, Australia. On the other corner, we see countries with low-income economies like Nigeria, India, Kenya, etc. What I want to point out, basically, is that at the policy level, there might be many programs that governments can support in order to, for example, increase the expenditure in education. Could be just one kind of policy that here was easy to get quantitative data, but of course could be educational reforms or any other kind of policy aiming to increase education. Let me call my attention a bit. China seems to be expanding. Is the x-axis show the expenditure in education seems to be expanding quite an amount of dollars in education in the last 2 decades. And let me make a zoom on that, and we will see basically that the education in China increased by about 6 times, more or less, while human capital increased by about 33%. This is one of the countries where human capital was increasing more than at a higher rate than others like, let's say, UK or Australia. Well, I had the task to summarize the result in 15 minutes. The report is very big, but I hope give you a first overview with these results, but I'll try to do some publicity on other chapters which probably will invite you to revise them. We were talking about inclusive wealth index. We also mentioned the idea of adjusted inclusive wealth index. That the main idea behind that is what happened with these 4 pillars or 3 pillars that we are measuring are affected by climate change, for example, or the productivity has been increasing. That means that when 1 unit of natural capital, for example, we can produce more flows to the economy or directly to the people. Or the third factor is regard oil capital gains. That is basically how increases in prices can help to build other forms of capital, especially for the oil extractive economies. So certainly, in this situation, for example, in the oil capital gains, some countries ranked way better, like in the case of Venezuela, for example, which turned from a positive to a negative, situation. Other chapters, we were talking about inclusive wealth at a national level, but we also have empirical evidence by breaking down the United States at the state level. So this is other of the applications that you will find in the report. Another chapter, and with this I will finish, is an empirical analysis of the natural assets in international trade. This is a from my point of view, a very interesting issue because, of course, many of the consumption that we might be having in Europe actually is taking place elsewhere. So here, when we see the economy, the world economy as a closed system, then probably the position of how different countries contribute to the depletion is different than the picture when we only look at the national borders. So this is more in the idea of a discussion when we move away from country specific to a global level and analyze the investment as well as the depletions. Okay, hope this this motivates people to look at this chapter 2 and the whole report, even if you are more, if you like more. But this is what I wanted to share with you. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Pablo. Let me open up the floor for questions, if anybody have any questions.
Okay. So, yeah, I have a question. My question would be, from my point of view, indices like this, one of the main purposes should be to give policy guidance. And my question is whether you are already thinking of a way in which this indicator, or maybe sub-aggregates of this indicator, could be used for policy guidance, whether development goals could be formulated using this indicator or parts of this indicator. And if you have thought about it, how would this look like?
No, I think that's a very good question, and that's exactly the way to go. When you try and get one index, a scalar, the idea is to I found it always useful in the social sciences to work backwards. In some Platonic ideal, you've got the scalar. But of course, that hides a lot of information. So what you want to do is to disaggregate. And the way you do it is, at least in the slide that I showed you, where the changes were shown per asset category. Some were negative, others were positive. And that's the kind of information you want to use for policy purposes. Remember, I had a slide in which I talked about substitutabilities across assets, across goods and services, and so forth. The dialogue really should be about that now, that you are saying that even if inclusive wealth per capita goes up, it could be that something is going up which is produced, but natural capital is going down. So the wealth component of natural capital, or rather the natural capital component of wealth, is worsening. And given that it's in finite supply, in terms of the maximum supply it can give you, that's a warning signal that you can't proceed along this indefinitely. You can't necessarily say what the crunch time is, partly because you don't know whether you can substitute your way out through trade. You lose your own asset, but in the old days, 200 years ago, the West didn't have a problem. It lost one source of coal, it went to another source. It lost one source of cotton, it went to another source of cotton, and so forth. So you can span geographically and then import your way out of any trouble. But those are the kinds of issues that are given quantitative shape by these estimates. In the absence of the estimates, you still have an insight. You know you're in trouble, because otherwise you wouldn't be doing these things. You know natural capital is exhausting, or you're encroaching upon it. But the quantitative estimates allow you to have a space in which you discuss quantitatively public policy, because it's giving you the substitutability in hard numbers, as it were. Admittedly, these are all approximate, probably wrong, but at least you know what you're arguing about, as opposed to vaguely saying, or saying that technology will help us out of these problems, which is very often still argued.
Hello, hi, thank you. My name is Annette. I go to the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. It's very, very interesting. Thank you so much. I had a quick question about the indicator that you utilized for education. I'm pretty sure that you've already kind of discussed it very, very thoroughly, but I was wondering if the issue of quality is at all going to be reflected in the IWI, considering, an extra 5 years in education in Finland is quite different from an extra 5 years in public education system in Brazil, for example, and has quite serious implications for sustainability. As we can see now in Brazil, for example, having not enough of a educated workforce to fill its economic boom. So just kind of wondering what the thought process was behind it, whether or not steps are taken to include that in some future.
Again, a very good question. Pablo will probably have some thoughts, give you my preliminary thoughts to what you're asking. you're quite right. But your complaint is very telling for something like the Human Development Index, because there they're only measuring years of education and independent of inequality adjustment, right? As you well know. What we're doing here is, again, it's subject to enormous possible criticism, but we are using it we're valuing it in terms of wage increases. Okay, because there's standard techniques that have been developed, and there's nothing new, original in either IWR 2012 or in the Arrow et al. Paper. When the process by which we're valuing education is concerned, we're literally lifting the technology that's been developed on the human capital literature. And there we are using essentially changes in wages due to additional year of schooling. So of course, their quality of education should matter. I mean, maybe the market doesn't pick it up, but you see, in principle, it should. So the analytical move is a correct one, but there will be errors residing in the estimates arising out of the fact that markets are very imperfect. But that's the best we can do at the moment. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Okay, my name is Daniel Sariche. I just want to ask a question on the index, how the index was calculated. I really like that presentation. It was very good insight for me. But what I would like to know is, did you take into consideration the value system in this country that you studied?
Sorry?
The value system. For instance, if one country value more human capital than natural capital, and they really try to assign weights by so doing, so that whether the application or non-application of the weights can affect the index that was calculated.
Well, this question could go on till midnight in discussing it, and we began discussing it at coffee time, and I don't have a satisfactory answer to your thing, but of course that's not an answer. I have to give you something like a first step towards an answer. We may actually overdo the cultural difference given the nature of the goods that are being estimated here. Because take climate change, for example. Suppose you have a reasonable climate model which tells you the loss in productivity of agriculture in, say, Ghana, resulting from a global climate mean temperature increase of 3 degrees, vis-a-vis Russian Federation since, well, not Ghana, give me one of your countries. In Africa, which one do you have?
South Africa.
South Africa versus Russia. Suppose we do. In other words, of course, the effect of global climate change is not going to be the same in the two, right? Because one is way up in one has the tundra kind of steppes in its, and the other is a Mediterranean country, essentially, in terms of climate, okay? Now, suppose you can estimate just for the sake of argument, the climate model tells you how much of agricultural productivity loss there would be relatively in the two. Suppose you can do that quantitatively in terms of bushels of wheat, just for the sake of argument. Now you're going to say, well, how do we know that the culture of South Africa shouldn't make the shadow price of wheat different from the shadow price of wheat in Russia? And you may start feeling a bit nervous saying that because wheat is traded. And you might say if there's a cultural difference, it doesn't matter because the trade is going to alter will be taking into account, the cultural difference will be taken into account in the trade price from standard economic reasoning, right? Values may be different, but if they're trading, then it can. So we could, in principle, if you had a good climate model, come up with a loss function for South Africa and a loss function for even although cultures differ hugely. I think things are going to really be pressing when it comes to ecological services, because many of these services are localized. And there's now a huge literature in anthropology in particular, which I know something about, which tells us how institutions differ, have evolved in some sense to cope with the differences in the geographical landscape or ecological landscape of nations, okay? Quite apart from many other differences. The point is, of course, here ecological services are not included because we haven't got the data on that. I think that's where it's going to be really significant cultural differences, because a a particular tree might have ancestral significance in one culture and not in another. And it'll be very, very location-specific accounting price for that tree. And you might say, well, why is it an ancestral thing? Of course, there are scholars who would say it can be like, you know, there's a great book in Indian ecology called Fishes by Gadgil and Ramachandra Guha. It's a great book, Fishes of the Land. And it's about an understanding of Indian religious, Hindu religious traditions and its relationship to the ecology of the northern Indian Gangetic plain during the period when Hinduism was developing. So there's no question, there is a connection there. But that connection is not picked up in the things that we are looking at here, unfortunately. But I think it will play a part when we study local environmental resources, because so many of the institutions of trade, of insurance, credit, which are all built around communities, communitarian rules and regulations, differ enormously from market for insurance and markets for credit. And I think that will make a real telling difference. But as of now, I can't see a single case where the culture plays a big role. For instance, the value of a statistical life. If there are cultural differences, that will be picked up. I was pointing out to differences across nations on the grounds that poorer countries have to face more risk. But there could be other things embedded, but that would be picked up in the prices of the value of statistical life. That is, what risk people are willing to take to be killed at work, for example, or to die at work. Well, thank you for asking. It's a very good question.
Before the next person, a quick question, Partha, is that the framework, I believe, allows to one to denote the social prices according to the different countries.
Oh, yes.
So the framework allows it. It's just a matter of whether the data is the database is available to take at that level. So just like ecosystem services are going to be the main challenge. The good news is that there's a new platform that's going to be established. Well, it's already established, called the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And the conceptual framework that has been provided actually has a strong notion of wealth and the asset base and the productive base. And so with that kind of platform, it might spur the activities on creating these kind of values that we need at the local level and at the national level.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Well, it's Raymond Bleichwitz from the Wuppertal Institute. I would like you to elaborate a little bit on how you calculated the natural capital in your report. Well, as long as eventually with some of the perspectives. You mentioned, for instance, that you did a sensitivity analysis with a different price of carbon. So my question would be, did it make a difference whether you calculated it with $200 instead of $50? And also, you're focusing on the subsoil assets, which is indeed not equivalent to any ecosystem services. How did you incorporate any, say, environmental restrictions in getting access to the reserves of minerals? Did you figure in shadow prices of energy and water as a proxy for declining ore grades? How did you incorporate the land prices? Did you figure in, say, the real estate prices of central London? Probably not. Or the shadow prices for food that have been emerging. So things like this. And if you would say a few more words, I will be indeed ready also to follow via email or read your report indeed. Thank you.
I'm not going to be speaking about IWR 2012 because Pablo is there, but you were addressing the question of sensitivity analysis, which is what I was pointing to. Yes, we did in our paper, and England was not included in our, so I don't know anything about the real estate price of London vis-a-vis Tokyo, for example. So objects like land prices, we took straight from national accounts of India. Take it or leave it. Obviously, we know it's missing many things. But the reason land prices are not a very bad thing to work with is that if it's agricultural land, many of the externalities within the land will have been presumably internalized. Not all, but many, obviously. So that not all ecological services were excluded, those which were already part of the value of land. Say, take, for example, the recent work that has taken place, which has shown how agricultural land values depend, among other things, on the distance from the edge of a forest. The closer it is to the forest, the more valuable the land, and the more productive the land, certainly, and then they can even regress it against the price of land if there is a market for agricultural land, which is not true, by the way, everywhere. In Africa, the market for land is very, very thick, whereas it's nice, thin markets in, say, Costa Rica and elsewhere. Now, the reason is that the land is enjoying an externality from the forest by virtue of the fact there are pollinators in the forest. And the closer the land is to the forest edge, the greater the number of pollinators which will be present in the land. And if you're very far away from it, you will have, other things being equal, less. So up to a point, land picks up these advantages. Okay. So regarding sensitivity analysis, we did it with carbon because the price of 50, which was our base price, when I say it's our base price, we're taking it off the literature, the consensus literature, in the sense of the literature which is looking at alternative climate models and doing something like a mean of the various models that are there. But of course, that's exactly where you do want to do sensitivity analysis. And I wanted to find out in particular at what price of carbon would US wealth have declined as opposed to gone up, just out of curiosity. It turns out that at about 250, it did decline. The threshold was, keeping the other prices fixed. Of course, you have a multidimensional diagram you have in mind, right? You have, if you have 10 or 15 natural capitals, you have 15 or shadow prices, and you have a big space on which you can do your sensitivity analysis. We did it by keeping the others fixed. We did it sequentially. We looked at do a sensitivity analysis in the paper, which if you have, you can take it online and read it. You'll find a lot of sensitivity analysis because we were looking at, for each country, the values of shadow prices at which the positive becomes negative. And it was about $250 where the US per capita growth became negative, negative growth. It was the critical one. Now, I don't know what to make of it because I'm not really an expert on climate models. I mean, I wouldn't know how to judge one model from another, compare one from another. So for me, doing sensitivity analysis is the only way to go because I can then say, well, here are the results. If you believe it's $300, then your view about what's been going on in these countries will be very different from what if it is 200. Of course, if it is very insensitive, then that's interesting because it says that even if you disagree, it doesn't matter because your view is going to be very similar as to what happened in the economy. Okay. Now, the other one, these are all aggregates, of course. These are aggregate figures, but you shouldn't. I don't think you should be skeptical of findings here that use aggregation, but not be skeptical about all other ways of looking at national accounts because they're all aggregates. I mean, if you look at the Indian national accounts, it's not going to be. It'll be building up from data coming in from the various states. Obviously, goes without saying, and the states will be getting data from the various districts. And the Central Statistical Organization Office is going to be doing the aggregation. But when you read the national accounts, you'll have something like a land price or a value of investment in the economy as a whole over a 10-year period. Take it or leave it, so to speak. Obviously, you could geographically split it up by saying the investment in Gujarat as opposed to net investment in Bengal and so forth. In principle, that can be done. We didn't have that kind of privileges to be able to do things like that. I mean, we were just lucky to be able to get away with the numbers that we got. But in principle, there's nothing preventing you methodologically from going to a very disaggregate model. I began by saying the economy could be a village even. You could ask the question, is this village now wealthier than it was before? And that would give you an indication of whether the village is better off in the same sense as for a nation. So no principle is involved here in the aggregation side, but in practice, of course, it is. Do you have any?
Maybe to complement a little bit with our experience in the report. Basically, regarding prices, what we did is to collect data from FAO on the value of the production and the type of crops. So basically, we analyzed about 160 different kind of crops and the correspondent values, and then we arrived into an average price per hectare of for each country. So, and then we see the land availability for cropland and for pasture land, and etc. So, regarding you go to the mining resources, maybe what you are thinking about is how, for example, the production of, let's say, gold or copper, maybe might influence the water flows for agriculture, will pollute maybe the production process of copper might pollute the river, and the river then will influence the agricultural sector. So unfortunately, we don't have prices, shadow prices at that level that can capture these cross-sectoral problems. But we, in the case of mining resources, we still use rental prices. Basically, the price of the resource, the market price, and we use the rental rates to get the rent of the resource.
There's a related question, since it's a very important question you've raised. Take the case of water contamination through industrial activity, the case that Pablo has just now mentioned. There are studies, say in Bangladesh, SANDI, the South Asian Network for Development and Environmental Economics, which has done pioneering work in trying to do this kind of micro studies. They will have estimates of that, but for a particular factory, and there are much more, of course, that's very believable results in terms of human health and so forth. Question, how do you then use it for Bangladesh as a whole? You can't, because that's just one, and you don't know how large it is, how significant, how standard that externality is throughout the country. So if you take that study seriously, you'll say, well, we could do a reasonably good wealth accounting for that particular district which has that contamination, because we've got a significant piece of the cake, so to speak, in our hand. Moving from there to the nation, of course, will be suicidal at this point, given that there aren't samples of studies like that for all of Bangladesh. When that happens, then you could do something like averaging, and then you use it for the nation. If you do it for the nation, you'll have to do some averaging. There's no getting away from that, because national accountants tell me otherwise you were just being too theoretical, because for them, aggregation is the name of the game. But as of now, I don't see how we can do it at the national level, because we don't have anything other than a few case studies. Take, for example, something that, again, is so much discussed, atmospheric pollutants on human health, throat and lung problems that crops up. We have studies of particular cities in airsheds under Dhaka, for example. There are nice case studies of that. Would you use the Dhaka case study to translate it to Beijing? I don't know. That would be hard. There need to be a separate study for Beijing. And of course, even within Beijing, one district within Beijing versus another. I mean, and then costs pile up. Costs of doing research piles up. If we can persuade funders to fund huge numbers of graduate students to do this very, very important work, nothing would please me more. And your question, of course, raises that particular issue. Namely, it's high time that funding is expanded on the study of nature. ecologists as well as epidemiologists and economists too. We are really at the start of a research program, nowhere near to the end of it.
You told us that you wrote a chapter about the impacts of trade, and I was wondering about the graph of the natural capacities. I saw that Japan and Germany as well had or neither, nor a negative natural capacity or next to zero. But on the other hand, countries like Saudi Arabia or Venezuela had very negative natural capacities. And I was wondering if you try to trace back, for example, the sources of German or Japanese growth in the productive capacities to countries like Saudi Arabia, to look if countries, if you trace them back, have like a sustainable growth path. Or if you didn't do so, if you're thinking about doing so.
Here
you can see it. Looking at Germany or Japan.
Yeah, Japan is even positive, for example. Yeah.
So if you assume that the growth in the productive manufactured capital bases on oil coming from Nigeria causing the huge negative natural capital in Nigeria, you could try to trace back to link this manufactured growth to the natural capital losses in these countries and say, okay, even if it looks so that Germany has this positive natural capital, or almost positive, it's not.
Yeah. The chapter certainly discussed that in the model you can even see where the impact takes place. But first, I think so we need to be clear about that there are kind of two sides of the coin. On the one hand, one country might be using the natural capital of the other nation, but the other nation at the same time is getting a rent for the resources that it's exporting. And very likely, or not very likely, but that rent can be reinvested in different types, of capital, like for example, investing in education. So the discussion has these two sides. On the one hand, physically speaking, you might be using, for example, there are a lot of literature and virtual carbon flows, for example, that many of the emissions which take place in China actually, the production there is for goods which are going to the United States, to Europe, and so on. So because of that, the paper, what is doing, in fact, is thinking about the world economy as a closed system and looking at the investments and then discounting, adding the expenditure in education, but discounting the natural capital from the different countries wherever it was depleted. So kind of to try to see these kind of drivers of the depletion of natural capital at a global level. But when you look at it at the national level, probably you should look at from an inclusive wealth perspective probably as a national level, because the rent of the resource is getting by the country in itself and then should be reinvested specifically in the case of non-renewable resources that by definition will be declining, but you can reinvest in other type of capitals.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I just have two short questions. First of all, what was the criteria to select those specific 20 countries? And the other, it's more for a practical matter, how challenging is to gather the data for the empirical analysis?
Regarding countries, we in fact selected the big economies. We started, then we thought that to analyze some resource-based economies, intensive in like minerals in Chile, as I mentioned, oil in Venezuela, or Nigeria or Saudi Arabia. Big population countries like China, India. Basically, was kind of in this way the process of choosing the countries. Might be biased because in South America, maybe because I'm from there, we have many, but in fact, the report also, we had in principle only 3 countries, but then we had 2 more because in the report there is one chapter about ecosystem services. So then we include ecosystem services in Ecuador and in Colombia. So we also we had to include 2 more to try to make some discussions. But basically, we wanted a representation of all continents, so we have Australia too. So that's the idea. Regarding data, we have actually, there you have kind of an idea of different assets that we are measuring. You can even break down the minerals, you can break down also the agricultural land in pasture land. So basically you have to apply some different models, different valuation techniques for different type of assets. So it can be a bit challenging, but the good point that when you do 20 countries, you can automate the process and run some loops, which makes life easier. So some days I left the office earlier.
You didn't tell me that. You always told you I was leaving at 12. Just for your information, we are now in the process of upgrading it. So by March, there should be about 100 countries in the database, which are at the same level as this 20.
I have 2 questions, actually more or less related to the question he just raised. So first is, both questions are more towards policy recommendations. So first, for the developed countries, if we see more or less the inclusive wealth index for these countries, say Germany, for example, or Japan, they are increasing and they have a positive trend. Since we, for example, for natural capital, we in this index, it didn't so much consider the impact of using the resources of other countries, say in China or in Saudi Arabia. So how can these index be used for the policy recommendation for the developed countries, say Germany? Would it be like saying that, okay, Germany is doing fine because this country is increasing all the almost all the categories of the production basis? And wouldn't this be misleading and towards the direction that all the developed countries should use this strategy to use the natural capital of other countries? And the second question is that, consider that we are all on the same boat and we are in the world, and that we have overall collectively limited resources, especially natural resources. Do you see any possibility for increasing the inclusive wealth for developing countries without limiting these for the developed countries? Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Okay. It's an extremely good question, and it's a very delicate one to answer. As an economist, I find sometimes now quite inexplicable that a rich country, both gives aid, significant aid, not to be sneered at, and at the same time ignores the externalities which are embedded in your question, which are actually reversing the aid flow. A good case, of course, is European agricultural subsidy policy. Your question is really concerned with the externalities that are there, and then the added ones which the restrictive practices or subsidies have on the distortion of trade, such that the market prices are way off the accounting prices that ought to be used. The answer has to be no. I think because of these distortions, which include the externalities generated by natural capital, which are so hard to pin down, means that when you add up the nation's performances, it doesn't add up to when you sum the nation's performances, they don't add up to the world's performance. that would happen only if there were no imperfections. So you're absolutely right. Because of that conclusion, it can't be the case that all countries can go the same way, because that will just exacerbate the problem. At the moment, it's not at all clear to me that there isn't, and I'm not a, you could probably see from my writings and certainly my personality, that I'm not a revolutionary and I have no intention of being a anti-establishment or anything. But there's something in 40 years of messing around with numbers tells me that in some cases there is a reversed resource transfer from poor countries to the rich ones. Not for the reasons that were being given by Prebisch and others in the 50s, not that, but by virtue of these natural capital externalities. Let me give you one example, and then you can see the potency of it. I can't give you a quantitative figure because I haven't got it. Indonesia has forest in the uplands, so does Malaysia, and that's hardwood. Much of it is hardwood, extremely in high demand by India and China now. So Indonesia logs timber up in the highlands and exports, let's say at CIF price, FOB price. And FOB price, let us say, is a pretty competitive price, just for the sake of argument. No distortion there. But the forests are protecting downstream farmers, soil erosion and so forth, water runoff. That damage that is caused by deforestation is not on the FOB price, because they're not having to compensate the farmers. Okay? So the FOB price is less than the social cost of timber, because people are being damaged downstairs, and they're not being compensated. Which means what? Which means there's a wealth transfer from Indonesia to China. And who is providing the transfer? Is being provided by implicit export subsidy. And who's providing the subsidy? Not from general taxation. It's from the poorest in society. I can't imagine this is not happening in other contexts as well. And for all I know, this is happening in Africa in a big way now that China has moved in there. I don't know. I can't give you figures. But this is a clear example of a wealth transfer. Nobody notices it. Farmers won't know they're being hurt because all they see is some reduction in the productivity. But hey, it could be God's will. Who cares? But what's happening is 200 miles up north, up in the highlands. So we have a problem. Ignoring natural capital and the externalities that natural capital generates, we've ignored it for such a long time that we forget that we could be having resource transfers all over the place which are just totally unaccounted for. And even as the rich give aid, much of it may be even wasted, there is an implicit transfer of wealth from the resource-rich countries, currently resource-rich countries. And of course, there is a willful destruction of natural capital because of bad governance. Brazil is a country which is literally cutting off the size of Portugal each year of its forest. Who cares? Nobody cares. Roads have to be built because there are minerals out there, or soybean has to be grown. So we got a huge mess. And I don't know what that tells about policy, but one can't but. The analysis here is really offering us the tools to study these phenomena, which are intuitively plausible, but they're giving some quantitative feel for it. But we are very far away from an understanding of who is supporting whom.
Last question.
Thank you. My name is Buddhika. I'm from UN Climate Change Secretariat. And first, I would like to thank Professor Gupta and all for the presentation and the lecture. And I understand that there is, the natural capital is decreasing in almost, all 19 countries except Japan. But my question is, what about the rate of decreasing? Is it in the positive side or in negative side? The reason I am asking this question is, since 1992, since the introduction of the Climate Convention, and also the introduction of the concept of sustainable development in Rio 1992, there are a lot of development on the sustainable development and green growth. So I was just wondering whether there's an impact on better utilization of the natural capitals within last 20 years? Thanks.
Yeah, some countries show some improvement despite that it was net negative. This is the case of UK, I think so. But I don't have unfortunately, the disaggregation. But if you see the case of UK, it looks like a kind of a U in the sense that. Okay, doesn't matter. Yeah. So some cases, like in the case of UK, it might show some improvement. The total average is negative, which is what we are looking here. But in some cases, but it also might be linked to production relocation. Also, you cannot, that improvement can happen in that way. So certainly this is an average. But when you in the report, you can see kind of this picture for the 20 countries. So you will have a better overview. I don't have all the pictures in mind now, but I remember the case of UK, for example, that showed first a decline, but for example, from 2000 onward, showed that it started to increase. Maybe more awareness about the environment or more policies, etc.
Yeah, just to follow up, I think what we did was you're looking at the second order rate of change, and we did it for 2 countries, Norway and UK, just to see what was happening. And the UK, you had a turnaround, whereas Norway was still going. So the second order is still as high as the first order. So, but these are just preliminary understandings of what's going on. All right, thank you very much. I just want to close off the presentation. First of all, thank you very much, Professor Dasgupta and to Pablo Munoz. I want to invite Dr. Gudrun Timm, who's from DEG, and I won't even attempt to say what that is in German. I'll leave it for her. But she is the Director for Economics, Evaluation and Development Policy. And I thought that she would be an appropriate speaker to round it off based on the experience that they have as an international German bank focusing on development issues and many questions on policy. So I thought to sort of see how she sees this report in terms of whether it would help or what needs to be done to really help people like her who are making decisions on foreign investment in a lot of developing countries. Gudrun?
Good evening, and thanks very much, Anantha, for the cordial invite. I feel honored to give you some of my reflections on that report. Well, being a practitioner in development finance, I'm not going to make any comments from an academic side, of course, but just to give you a couple of ideas what struck me when I looked into that report and discussed it with Anantha. When we see a lot of indices and reflections on wealth concepts, you know them all, and you get this new inclusive wealth index in your hands, you wonder what is new about this index, actually. And, well, I would say it changes our view, how we look at countries. Actually, any economic activity has implications on the various sorts of capital or types of capital that are discussed in this report. And what I think is achieved in this report is that it shows the nexus among those impacts and among those types of capital. This nexus is something we talk a lot about, and it's a very intriguing way of making it transparent. And I think the most easy way to look at it is looking into this summary that was offered to us at the entrance, and to see how various countries are compared against each other. Now, when I look at some maybe more detailed points, I'd first like to give you a brief outline of our business model, because the way a German Investment and Development Corporation, a DEG, or 17 other institutions in Europe work is investing into private equity in emerging markets. So we are part of official cooperation, but we're not part of aid. We are part of development effectiveness in the way that we try to invest in capital stock in emerging markets. And in this, we have been following a concept of sustainability for a long time. I mean, sustainability, you know it, it's from the German forestry. It's 200 years old, the concept. And it's been very, very hip the past 15 years, if not longer. But what do you understand by it? And our understanding of sustainability when we invest with private companies in emerging markets has three types. One is the financial way, because we think financial sustainability is key to our investment activity. If we burn capital, there is no development whatever. There might be some nice Schumpeterian destruction processes going on, but basically the objective that we had in the first place has failed. We are including ecological and social risk management features into our investments. So the natural capital and the HR side of it is what we tackle with each and every investment on the micro level. And we also look on a national level and development effects that we have on, let's say, government revenues and how far are governments enhanced in performing their own duties, and how far are jobs being created, both human capital and also economic in the sense. So various ideas that have been so nicely quantitated in this report came to our minds early on, and we needed to all balance them. And that's actually the achievement, I think, to run it down by sound quantitative data and then find an index that you can refer on. As I said, our business model is to invest with private companies. Of course, we do it on the micro level. Yeah? We are not government, we're not government policy, but we are very much influenced by government policy, because actually how various countries perform is the environment where we work in. And on the micro level, every investment that we do is also changing those types of capital, although probably only in a very small scale. But the main leverage that we see in the work that we do is actually technological innovation, is job creation, vocational training. So it's not only the number of jobs, but it's decent works where people can live on and their families can live on. And it's also the quality of life and the effects that are spread in the population. So what I liked very much about that report was that it has a very strong focus on manufacturing. Yeah, a lot of, when you talk about natural capital and talk about climate issues, a lot of people only invest in renewable energy or in energy efficiency measures, but what actually a lot of development countries still need is a diversification in their production base. Something to start on. They have natural resources. Some of them have nice sceneries and tourism, and natural resources are the first industries where they start from. But actually to build a sound base of light industry or other kinds of manufacturing is lacking, and I appreciate that this is reflected in the report. Now, when it comes to the socioeconomic effects and the cost-benefit analysis that was mentioned in the first place, we feel a challenge to perform that in a lot of investments that we do. And if you think about the areas where we are active, is it agriculture? Then on the positive side, we are kind of connected with the area of food security. On the other hand, we are very much focused on issues like land grabbing, and there are immediately positive and negative effects that we need to deal with when we, or before we invest, and to get a notion of the socioeconomic effects on both sides of the balance before we decide whether it's good or not good to proceed, or if we proceed, how we should proceed and how we should outweigh the various measures. If we invest in a private wind park, there are other questions. If we invest in a paper factory, there are always questions about what kind of capital do you increase and what do you decrease. So on a micro level, we are used to that question, but sometimes it's very hard to answer it, and that's why I'm thankful on a large level where countries are concerned, where the team has made this analysis. I want to be very quick because time has been running, but when I look at the results, maybe I can give you just some ideas when it comes to policies, although I'm not a policy maker. But of course, it was already mentioned in the audience, we can very easily see that some countries live very well off other countries' wealth. We all know that, but this is now made transparent and very clear. And it should have implications, I think, both on industrialized countries' policies as well as on developing countries' policies. Because the lady was already commenting on Germany or Japan, but look, if people in Russia or Saudi Arabia get access to this report and see what the policy has driven them at, yeah? So there is some explosive material that you have provided, and I wonder how this is going to be taken up. Also, the question: how long can you afford a certain way of economic development? Was quite surprised actually that China is showing such a good performance, because the math is that industrialized countries live on production in China, which on itself is polluting the environment. However, the decrease in natural capital in China is not that bad. So it would probably be worthwhile to look more deeper into the analysis and the sub-indicators that are being used. The question of the UK was mentioned several times. That's an example where I wondered, because obviously the UK has rid itself of any kind of manufacturing, totally relying on financial services and tertiary sector. So, of course, yeah, there is not much natural capital wasted, but what does it tell us? So I'm wondering how the policy dialogue is actually taking place in the last place. What I would encourage the team is, if I may say, as a recipient and working in development countries, of course, I am very much looking forward to the greater coverage that Anantha was mentioning, 100 countries coming soon. Because then the comparison of the emerging markets worlds where we work is compelling. And also the data issue is, I think, the most relevant point that we would seek from a report like this. So far, there are data until 2008, and I think the climate change issues are accelerating, and while people are still debating whether it's going to be 2 degrees or 5, the living situation in these countries that are affected most are changing so quickly that probably data as close as you can get would be very helpful. On a last bit, what can you do with this report? I was thinking about many indices that we use in our work, and coming from Germany, Bertelsmann Transformationsindex, or looking into the doing business of the World Bank, those are indices that have become really powerful. And I can only encourage you to use the results. When you look at the Doing Business Index on the methodological way, it's always criticized, and of course there are many things that you can say. On the other hand, you see countries lining up at the World Bank's office and say, what do we need to do in order to become better? And we have, in The Economist, you see a full page of Georgia as #1, because this country was managing to just hop 20 ranks in the Doing Business indicator by performing very strict policy reforms. Now, if that's the effect that you want, I do not know, but probably any country would not like to be in the far end bit like the countries I just named. So maybe it is a powerful tool, and I would like to wish you every success and luck with it. Thank you.